All right, microscopic structure of cardiac muscle. So myocardium is, of course, going to be made of the cardiac muscle tissue, the only place that we find it in the body. Cardiac muscle cells are short and branched, which makes them very different from skeletal muscle. They can have 1 to 2 central nuclei, and they're supported by our areolar connective tissue, also called the endomysium. So the sarcolemma, also known as the plasma membrane of the cell, is going to invaginate into the cardiac muscle to form these guys called T-tubules that are going to extend into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is just that endoplasmic reticulum that we find in muscle cells that surrounds these bundles of myofilaments, same myofilaments that we find in skeletal muscle, just connected a little bit differently. So we're going to look closer into that. So those myofilaments are arranged into sarcomeres, just like we find in skeletal muscle. It gives rise to that striated appearance under the microscope, just like we find in skeletal muscle again. The optimal length or the maximum overlap of your filaments is seen when the heart is stretched by blood filling the chamber. So it actually goes ahead and is going to stretch it out so that you have this optimal length that is created so that the filaments can contract with a greater amount of force with more blood. So the intercellular structures of the cardiac muscle, the sarcolemma or that plasma membrane is folded at connection between the cells. This increases the structural stability of the myocardium and it facilitates communication between the cells. So remember that communication between the cells is super, super important. And that's why we're going to go ahead and find that the cells are connected with these intercalated discs. Intercalated discs makes cardiac muscle special. And what this allows is there are these desmosomes and these gap junctions that create these connections. So the desmosomes are going to mechanically join the cells with these protein filaments, and the gap junctions are going to electrically join the cells that are going to allow ions to easily flow in between each of the cells in their intercalated discs so that the heart can function as a complete functional syncytium. So we'll see that here, right? Here are desmosomes that are going to be mechanically connecting the cells together, right? So they're kind of like, to me, it almost looks like these puzzle pieces, or even hands, that are going to go ahead and connect together really nicely, just pushing into each other, connecting, interlocking, and that's what we see here, right? These are the intercalated discs. This is just a closer up version of it to show us the mechanical connection there, and then these gap junctions here that are going to allow for that electrical connection between them. And of course, we can see again here the striations of each of those sarcomeres and the ends of them, and then the intercalated discs with the desmosomes and the gap junctions. Of course, we can see the sarcolemma here and also the T-tubules that are coming through. And then there's the different striations that we're finding from the Z disc and the different bands that we find within the sarcomere. All right, so with the cardiac muscle and how it's able to actually produce energy and use it, you obviously are going to have a huge demand for energy, right? So they're going to have an extensive amount of blood supply so that you've got lots of oxygen coming in, lots of mitochondria to be able to produce all of that ATP and energy, and then you have myoglobin and creatine kinase that are going to help also with ensuring that you have enough of both of these, right? So they're able to use different types of fuel molecules. So we can go ahead and convert fatty acids, glucose, lactic acid, amino acids, and ketone bodies from the food that we eat that we find within our bloodstream to go ahead and produce that energy or that ATP, right? But our cardiac cells are going to specifically focus on using aerobic metabolism. And so they're going to be pretty susceptible to having failure if you don't have enough oxygen, right? So when you're working out super hard and you're not getting enough oxygen, it makes it really hard for your cardiac muscle to go ahead and work properly. So that interference is going to go ahead and affect our blood flow to the heart muscle and can actually cause cell death if you're not careful enough. So the fibrous skeleton of the heart is this dense, irregular connective tissue that we find. So the heart has kind of its own skeleton, which is pretty cool. It provides structural support at the boundary of the atria and the ventricles. And it's forming what we call fibrous rings that anchor the valves, so those AV valves and the semilunar valves. It also provides a framework for attachment of the cardiac muscle. So if you remember, muscle needs something to go ahead and be able to pull on, just like our skeletal muscle pull and go ahead and contract and shorten. Same thing's going to be happening with that cardiac muscle, so it has its own fibrous skeleton here. It also acts as an electrical insulator, preventing the ventricles from contracting at the same time as the atria, right? So the atria have their own electrical impulse that comes through, and normally you might see that it would just travel down to the ventricles, right? But instead we have the skeletons that's going to stop it. And so we can see this top part here that we have this fibrous, this dense irregular connective tissue that's going ahead and coming all around here, and we can see it anchoring the valves and protecting the ventricles from the atria when they go ahead and contract. So what's cool here also is that our cardiac tissue actually is spirally arranged. So the muscle cells are going to be attached to the fibrous skeleton, and then they're arranged in spiral bundles. So the atrial contraction is going to move the wall inward. So if we see here in the green section, it's squeezing the top of it inwards. And then the ventricular contraction is going to be like wringing a mop. So if we see here, it's kind of doing this circular motion and wringing the end of it. Okay, so it's beginning at the apex and then it's going to compress it superiorly, which is important, right? Because we want our blood to actually be flowing upwards into our aorta, into our pulmonary trunk, and out into the lungs or into the rest of the body. So we need that flow to actually be going upwards. So it's important that this cardiac muscle is kind of doing this ringing action down here so that it moves the blood up superiorly. All right, so a couple of things for checking our understanding. What is the inner layer of the heart wall and what is its function? So that's going to be the endocardium. So think endo for inside. I'll try to write it here. And it covers the internal surface of the heart and the external surface of the valves. Which type of heart valve is associated with the tendinous cords? Those are going to be our AV valves, so the bicuspid and the tricuspid valves. So AV here. And what two functions do intercalated discs serve? So one thing, they've got the desmosomes, which are going to mechanically connect the muscle cells of the cardiac muscle together. And then we also are going to have the gap junctions that are going to electrically join the cells to make a functional unit. All right, so our last part here, talking about the coronary vessels, the blood supply within the heart wall. So coronary circulation, of course, is going to be super important to go ahead and ensure that our heart has enough oxygenated blood. So we have the coronary arteries bringing in oxygenated blood, and then the coronary veins are going to be taking the deoxygenated blood away from the heart towards the right atrium to go back through the lungs. So there's the right and the left coronary arteries, and they're going to sit in the coronary sulcus that we already kind of talked about. They're the first and only branches off of the ascending aorta, and we found those within the aorta when we were dissecting the pig heart. Then you have the right marginal artery that's going to break off of the right coronary artery, and then the posterior interventricular artery. So just notice that the right one's going to supply the right heart border, and then the posterior interventricular artery is going to go ahead and supply the posterior left and right ventricle. Now, the left coronary artery also has some branches. It has the circumflex artery, which is going to supply the left atrium and ventricle, and then the anterior interventricular artery, which is going to supply the anterior surface of both ventricles. So we already had the posterior taken care of, and it supplies most of the interventricular septum, which remember was super big in between the right side and the left side of the heart there, with the ventricles being separated, right? So this is called the widowmaker. The anterior interventricular artery is called the widowmaker because if it goes ahead and gets blocked, it can go ahead and cause death in the individual that has a blocked anterior interventricular artery. So we can see those here, right? We have our left coronary artery starting right here, and then it's going to break into that circumflex artery and the anterior interventricular artery, also known as the widowmaker, right? And then our right coronary artery is splitting off into the posterior interventricular artery and then the right marginal artery. Okay, so the coronary arteries are functional end arteries. So although the structural anastomosomes exist, blockage of a coronary artery leads to insufficient flow to the heart wall. So all those anastomosis is they just are options for where the vessels could go or the blood could go somewhere else just in case one was blocked. These ones aren't. So that means that if we don't have enough and there's a blockage somewhere in those, it's going to cause insufficient flow to the heart, and that can cause pretty serious things, right? Like the heart could stop functioning because it's not getting enough oxygen. So coronary flow intermittent with heart contractions, right? So remember that when the heart is contracting, it's going to actually go ahead and compress the vessels of the coronary arteries, and so only when it's relaxed can those go ahead and provide blood to the heart muscles. So then we have, of course, our coronary veins that are going to drain that deoxygenated blood. We have the great cardiac vein that sits in the anterior interventricular sulcus in the front, the middle cardiac vein which sits in the posterior interventricular sulcus in the back, and then the small cardiac vein which sits next to the right marginal artery on the right side, and then the coronary sinus which sits in the posterior aspect of the coronary sulcus, and that's where all of that deoxygenated blood from the cardiac arteries into the veins is going to drain into the right atrium until it goes to the lungs. And so that's what we can see here. So our middle cardiac vein, our small cardiac vein, that big old coronary sinus draining into the right atrium, and then the great cardiac vein. So a little view from the clinical side, the angina pectoris and myocardial infarction, these are some things that can happen if we have issues with those blood vessels. So the atherosclerosis just means that we have plaques that are narrowing the coronary arteries, of course, talking about that widowmaker there. And then we have coronary spasm, which is a sudden narrowing of vessels. And both of these can lead to angina or myocardial infarction. Angina pectoris is just pain. Usually it's going to be on the left side of the chest or the left arm or jaw, and it's usually a referred pain when we're performing some sort of strenuous activity. Treatments are going to induce vascular dilation so that you don't have this, these narrowing of vessels occurring. The myocardial infarction, which is just a heart attack, right, means that you have a sudden and complete occlusion or a blockage of coronary artery. The myocardium is deprived then of oxygen, and so of course it is probably going to go ahead and start dying. Those cells are going to start dying. It's going to cause excruciating chest pain, and it's going to radiate down the left arm. Again, that tends to happen with heart issues. You're going to feel it on the left side of your body. It's going to be a referred pain, even though it's in your chest. It's going to go ahead and come down that left side. And so then, of course, we're going to see the weakness, shortness of breath, nausea, anxiety, and sweating just because the heart isn't able to do what it's supposed to do. All right, so a couple of questions. What did we learn? Which coronary artery gives rise to the circumflex artery? That is going to be the left coronary artery. And then what path would a blood cell take if it were traveling from the aorta to the right ventricular wall and then back to the coronary sinus? So it would be going into the ascending aorta. It's going to go into the right coronary artery, into the posterior interventricular artery, into the middle cardiac vein, into the coronary sinus, and of course that's going to drain back into the right atrium.